Hello and welcome to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez. I am a principal in search of wisdom, and I have found productivity to be a great tool for success. Today, I have the great and distinguished honor of interviewing Kim Marshall, who was the sixth grade teacher, central office curriculum director, and elementary principal in the Boston Public Schools for 32 years. Since 2002, Kim has provided one on one coaching for principals. In addition, Kim consults, speaks, and teaches courses for school leaders with a special focus on teacher supervision and evaluation, time management, the effective use of student assessments, and curriculum unit design. Kim also writes the uber famous The Marshall Memo, a weekly summary of helpful articles for principals, teachers, superintendents, and other educators. He is the author of a number of articles and books, including Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation. Kim Marshall, who are you?
I'm Kim Marshall, and I've been in this business for about 53 years. Stumbled into it. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm happy to be here.
So awesome. Can you please walk us through your professional trajectory up to this point?
Sure. So I was born in California. I lived briefly in the East Coast, and then my father was stationed in Germany. So I spent a couple of years in Germany, came back to Washington, D.C., then went to a boarding school in England, really actually very positive experience, which was sort of strange. There's a whole story behind that. Then came back to college here. And in 1969, graduating from college, it was right in the middle of the Vietnam War. And all of my classmates and I had to make some decisions. We knew that the war was wrong. We did not want to go and do immoral things in Vietnam on behalf of our country, but we loved our country and wanted to do something. And so what I fell into, and again, this is very much a product of the times, was urban teaching, which at that point was draft deferrable. So you could get a draft deferment if you were a teacher in an urban school. There was another reason for doing that rather than the Peace Corps going to another country or a Vista going to the American South, which was that I was in love with this young woman in Boston, and she was finishing up college, and I did not want to leave the Boston area. So being a Boston teacher sort of popped up to the top there, along with, I would say, idealism, wanting to serve the nation, anti-war sentiment. So idealism, love, and war, those things that got me into education. And I did not really intend to stay very long. It was sort of a short-term thing to avoid the draft and to do something constructive for the country. But after a horrible first year of teaching, in which I got my butt kicked by a bunch of very lively sixth graders at the Martin Luther King School in Boston, I got my act together and was at that school for 11 years. And actually, for a long time, didn't think I would really leave the classroom. It seemed like a good place to be. I was, got my things. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about my struggles early on, but I ended up writing curriculum, doing other good things, being a leader in the school. We were in the middle of Boston desegregation in the mid 70s. Our school went from being all African American to being voluntarily integrated and as part of a magnet program. So that's sort of the whole teaching piece. Then I got a bee in my bonnet about being a principal. Read some of the early research on effective school. Principal is the key person. And went back to grad school for a year. Then Boston closed a whole bunch of schools, as I wasn't going to be a principal, and then ended up in the Boston office. And actually an assistant to the superintendent, as you mentioned, director of curriculum for the Boston schools. Still wanted to be and finally persuaded the superintendent to make a principal in 1987 and became principal of the oldest elementary school in America, the Mather School in Boston, and was there for 15 years. And then got exhausted, which is a burnout problem that a lot of us have to deal with, and then became a consultant writer, and as you mentioned, a coach or principal. So that's the trajectory in brief.
Wow. Can you tell us how the bee stung you in terms of I want to be from teacher, I want to be a principal?
Well, I can make a big difference for the sixth graders that I had. I usually had, 25, 26 sixth graders each year. But I began to see that the way they did in seventh grade was really important, and eighth grade, and that maybe my preparation wasn't part of a coherent program in our sixth, seventh, and eighth grade school, and that if the school, see the effective schools research tuned me into the not only the impact of the individual teacher, which is tremendous or potentially tremendous, but also of the school. And so, what's the school unit? And of course, the person who has the most influence on that is the principal. So I began to see a broader impact as a principal. I still think the principalship is sort of the job in education, but so that's what got me out of the classroom into the principal's office. And you notice I had it backwards. I was in the central office before I was a principal, and that was just happenstance. But I did not actually. There's one job that I wish I had, maybe I still will have, which is the person who is over principals, the person
Mm.
who evaluates principals, or the area superintendent, or in smaller districts, the superintendent. That person can have a tremendous impact by supporting and butt kicking and redirecting and training principals so that they do a better job of their work. I never wanted to be a superintendent because so much of that is political and also rather fraught, pretty high turnover in the principal and the superintendent ranks. So I have not wanted to be a superintendent.
What did you, what caught your attention when you transitioned from the school to district office curriculum director? Any surprises?
Well, we had a very wishy-washy curriculum in Boston at that point, and there was a group in the middle of trying to change it under the previous superintendent. And it wasn't going very well, so I really saw an opening and persuaded the new superintendent, Bud Spillane, in 1980, 81, to put me in charge of doing a more focused job of really sort of grade by grade expectations. That was what was missing. A fourth grade teacher did not have a clear idea of what their work was and how it fit into the broader K to 12 sort of mission of the school district. And I think that's a big problem. And actually, I, as a sixth grade teacher, was very much guilty of freelancing, of kind of doing things would entertain the kids that I was interested in, like the Bermuda Triangle, and a lot of activism at that point. I had posters of Angela Davis and Malcolm X up on my wall. I was just sort of a militant young teacher, and that's well and good. But what about the math that was needed for a sixth grader to be successful in seventh grade? What about the history that was part of an overall kind of K to 12 history part? What about the science? What about the books that they needed to read to be well-educated people? So I think, I saw the need for a coherent K to 12 curriculum, and we did a good job of that in the central office. We really did put together, curriculum objectives. Still got them up on the shelf here. 80, 81 up to 84, we did a good job in K to 12 of clear expectations for each grade level, which is now commonplace. I mean, most teachers now have a pretty clear idea of what a sixth grader should know by the end of the year, but it was not the case in 1980 when I came into the central office, 1981.
Wow. When you transition as a principal, how was that first year?
It was pretty rocky. I almost got fired, just like fired in my first year as a teacher. I made a colossal mistake of getting provoked by a group of people who did not take, shall we say, they did not take a liking to me as somebody who had come from the central office, someone who had gone to Harvard, someone who was, just sort of this pretty young whippersnapper principal who was thought that all children could learn, and we were going to have a really effective school. And there were some pretty hard-bitten, cynical people in the school, and I called them the Gang of Six. That there was a group of people who just really declared war on me, and they started provoking me, and I unfortunately took the bait. And I can tell you the story if you want, but basically,
Please. I know it's in your book, which, by the way, is read by like a novel. So it's lovely. But can you tell us that story?
Well, so they had a satirical newsletter, anonymous newsletter that they put on people's mailboxes. Of course, this is pre-email and the internet. This is like 1981. And it was really pretty sarcastic, and they ridiculed me as this idealist with rose-colored glasses, and And what a fool he is to think that all children can learn. And interestingly, these teachers really, they're all white females. They all had this sense of themselves as martyrs in a heroic cause. They thought they were working hard, and they were not bad teachers. Uh, but they really took a dislike to my idealism and my energy and the way I was trying to run the school. I was putting out a newsletter every day, the Mather Memo, and I was running around the school and getting into classrooms and so forth. And so anyway, this satirical newsletter went into people's mailboxes, and I thought, okay, let that run off my back. And then they did another one that was even nastier than the first one. And I looked at the handwriting, and I thought I could identify the handwriting of the person who had done this. So I called her into my office and said, knock it off. This is not good for staff morale. And she denied that she had written it, and went out and hollered and screamed, and other people came in, and someone else came in and took responsibility. I said, no, it wasn't you. And then my boss gave me the horrible advice of calling in the school police to do a analysis, and all hell broke loose. The entire staff, including the people who were sympathetic to me, went down to my boss's office and said, you got to get rid of this guy. He's nuts. So they brought in a mediator. We talked it through. I apologized. And basically one of the veteran teachers said, okay, let's turn over a leaf. Let's give him another chance.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the turning point, that things then began. And then I had a group of people we got some extra funding. We did a lot of innovative stuff. And then it just took off. Well, okay, now let me say that never really took off, but we became a much more effective school. Our test scores went up dramatically. We were one of the highest gaining schools in the state. We got a lot of recognition. I got a lot of recognition. But that was a real crisis. And I guess my biggest piece of advice from that was, rather than accusing people, I should have talked to my friends. I mean, there were a lot of people in the school who were sympathetic, who did like what I was doing, or at least the beginning of it, and they would have told me, and it could have been. And yet, on the third hand, probably there was going to be a confrontation with these people. It was going to happen because they were so negative about me, and they were not going to get sweet talked or charmed into it. And I have to say, there was a lot of mediocre teaching in the school, and our student achievement was pretty wretched. I mean, right down at the bottom of the Boston Public Schools.
Wow.
And there was some rationalizing about that. Well, these children come from poverty. It's a very difficult neighborhood. It's a lot of violence and so forth. So we got to really feel sorry for these kids. And I was not buying that. So anyway, that's the brief story.
Wow, that's amazing. Let me ask you. In the book, you mentioned about the grievance that you had to deal with. Can you tell us about that story?
Right. Well, I really believed in getting into classrooms and showcasing good practices. Another one of my colleagues in Boston was in another elementary school, and she called it opening classroom doors. So she would go in and she would write up and praise teachers and give them. And I had been trained by John Safier, so I knew how to really do good write-ups. And so I started going into classrooms and being quite positive and doing write-ups. And apparently that was a violation of the union contract, because if you do a write-up, then you have to go through and fill out the whole checklist, which we had at that point. I didn't want to do that. I didn't see it as evaluation. I saw it as more coaching and appreciation. And so they filed a grievance, and I lost. So that's not a good thing to happen. You should not lose a grievance in your first year as a principal. And I was very chagrined about that. And that made me very gun shy for a while. I really, I sort of kind of backed off a little bit, didn't get into his classrooms as much. Now I was busy, of course, doing all kinds of other stuff and figuring out the cafeteria and, running around and solving discipline problems and, helping out and fixing the Xerox machine and stuff like that, important that. But I wasn't, and it took me a few years before I sort of figured out a better approach to coaching teachers.
Wow. And when did you regain the confidence from backing up to, listen, I'm going to revisit the classrooms and do it perhaps more effectively?
Well, there are a couple of things. One was that we brought in Jeff Howard, who's an amazing, I don't know if you've ever seen Jeff Howard in action. He's a African-American social psychologist, actually a college classmate of mine at Harvard 69, who developed a whole theory, which is very similar to Carol Dweck's, which is a sort of confidence effort development. Think you can, work hard, get smart. Really, and he, I brought him in, and he did training with our staff, and it was well received, except again the negative people. did not take him. One person in the middle of the day, was overheard in the bathroom, the ladies' room, saying, "If I had a gun, I would shoot Jeff Howard dead." So there were strong anti-feelings. But a couple of years later, I brought in Jeff's people for a 3-day training on efficacy, which is, again, the psychology of positive achievement. And that really began to take hold. But a number of people, I remember that one of the teachers, Sandy Johnston, had up in her window. So our school was visible from the harbor in Boston, from the expressway, and you could see the windows up there. And she had in her window ZOD, Zone of Development, which was one of Jeff's big things. The sweet spot of challenge and difficulty and rigor and so forth. So that really began to take hold. The second thing was that we got some real money and began to do some innovative things. We realized the kids needed to get out into the community, get out into the museums and other things in Boston. And so we had the money for what we called the Mather-mobile. So it was the Mather School. It was the Mather-mobile, a bus we had every day at our disposal, a school bus. And so every day we were able to schedule a class to go off, a couple of classes to go off to, the Zoological Museum, the aquarium, to other things around Boston, historical sites, the Freedom Trail, and get kids out into the community. And then, of course, have academic follow-up on that. So that was good. And then the other big thing that happened was that this took a few years, I stumbled upon the idea of short, frequent, unannounced classroom visits with face-to-face feedback. And the face-to-face feedback finessed the issue of write-ups, because I wasn't write-ups. I was just having a conversation. And people were a little bit leery of this at first, unannounced visits. So what's up with that? Because I still had to do the traditional system. But then pretty quickly, people liked the idea of my popping in and then catching them later that day or the next day for a brief conversation in which I would talk, appreciatively about what they were doing. And then maybe there was sort of one thing that I would suggest, the way we're calling on kids or something of that nature. And I really got into a rhythm of doing about 3 of these a day. I had 40 teachers and 42 teachers, and if I did 3 a day, I think by the end of the year I'd done 10 or 11 per teacher, but I didn't write it up. You see, so I didn't fall into the grievance problem. Tremendous amounts of information really built trust, and just there was an ongoing conversation about teaching and learning going on. It was tremendously beneficial for me, and I think for a lot of teachers. And we really began to climb and get better. We also put a lot of effort into curriculum coherence, because the MCAS, the Massachusetts test, which for the first time in a long time brought about clear curriculum standards for each grade level. This is like 1998. We figured out, okay, so if that's what the 4th grade is, then we can figure out, so what's 4th grade, 3rd grade, 2nd grade, 1st grade, kindergarten, and what's 5th grade. And we then really articulated clear curriculum expectations for each grade level, and that was a huge help too. I want to emphasize, going back to what I said earlier, clear curriculum for each grade level. We're talking about the what. So what in practice, not the how-to. And I think the how-to, how it's taught, should be very much up to teachers, teacher teams, schools, and so forth. That should not be dictated or scripted from above. What should be scripted, though, is when we teach the Holocaust, when we teach fractions, when we teach algebra, specifically the rigorous expectations for this, 7th grade social studies class. That should be clear, and that should be part of a coherent sequence, from grade kindergarten, pre-kindergarten to 12. But the how-to, that's where you want the creativity. That's where you want teacher teamwork, figuring out, well, afraid, your kids did better than mine. What did you do? How can we teach that better? That's the proper balance, I think, between top down and bottom up.
When you decide, after many years and successes, to hang out your gloves, do you remember your last day? And what can you share about that last day?
As a teacher or
as a principal? As a principal.
Well, I didn't think I was hanging up my gloves, because I was only I was not that old, but I was not retirement age, so I couldn't. I was not retiring. I was leaving the principalship, and it was voluntary. I was not kicked out. They tried earlier on, but that didn't work out. But just after 15 years, and first of all, I gave people plenty of notice. I told people in February, this is my last year. We'll be leaving. So they started a search, brought in a good person, etc. But I certainly remember the goodbye party that people threw for me, which was, a big deal. A lot of people were there. I still have the photograph of everybody, wishing me well. Here's an interesting story from that last party. And I gave a speech, and my wife was there, and she talked, and people were sad to see me go, but wished me well. And they knew I would go on to do other stuff. But in that party, there was an interesting moment. There was a teacher, a veteran teacher in the school, who was terrific. In fact, I got her the Golden Apple Award right early on. By the way, that's one thing I did. I got more Golden Apple Awards for teachers in Boston. I was really making sure affected people were being recognized. The Boston Public Schools had this big deal, big party. The mayor. So that teacher, when I did one of my traditional observations with her very early on, I think it was my second year, I watched her do a lesson on estimating the amount of raisins in the little boxes of raisins. It's a sort of classic sixth grade or fifth grade lesson, and she did it well. It was a real show. And when I called her into my office for the debrief, and the write up, I pointed out that she had mixed up the terms mean, median, and mode, and so she had made a mistake in the way she was presenting this, and she cried. Right there in my office, she wept. And she's, older than me, experienced teacher, very good teacher, and so forth. And to have this principal, critique her, it was really bad. So anyway, 12, 13 years later at the goodbye party. Do you remember that? And she said, we're talking like 12 years later, 13 years later. And she said, oh yeah, I remember it. And I said, so what was your takeaway? And she said, never to take a risk. So that was another indictment of the traditional teacher evaluation process. Big deal, high stakes, it's written out, it's in a record and that kind of stuff. And she's humiliated and she cries. But her takeaway is not, oh, I've got to fix that. Her takeaway was, don't take any risks, especially in front of the principal. So contrast that to a mini observation dynamic where, I'm in the classroom a lot. I might see something, but it's verbal feedback. The teacher fixes it, or better still, I'm in the teacher team meeting where the fifth grade team is discussing, and somebody else says, was that mean or was that Modi? And and they figure it out and they fix it by themselves because they spot it. And so it's you bring this whole thing down to lesson by lesson. The way it's being taught and the assessments that are being given, do we have that right, and so forth. And that was another one of my big mistakes, was I didn't look at teachers' assessments. I wasn't inspecting. I went into a classroom and they were taking a test. I'd turn around and walk out and come back later. But what I should have done was go in and look over the kid's shoulders at the test and the rigor level, the quality of questions, and so forth, and then talk to the team about the test. And then, oh yeah, look at the results of the test. So how do they do? And why were so many kids getting number 12 wrong? What was up with that? And get teachers having that kind of discussion. That's the real work. Always looking at student results.
I see. When you, in your book, one of the big achievements is getting an agreement with the union that instead of doing those long evaluations, to use the supervision and the conversations instead. Can you tell us about that success?
Well, I think it happened gradually. As I said, initially people were suspicious of the idea of these short, frequent, unannounced classroom visits, but the face-to-face conversation is the key thing there, because that's when the teacher can say, I'm having a bad day, or this student is particularly upset because his father was just beaten by the police or something, and my mother has cancer, something is going on, or the machine broke down that I was using or something, and not excuses but reasons. Or I'm particularly excited about this. Can you come back and see this? So fairly early on, as I started this, I started the mini observations. I won the trust of teachers that I wasn't out to get them, that it wasn't going to be a gotcha, that I was really interested and curious in what was going on in their classrooms. And so that built the base so that when we basically took a vote, a staff vote, because in Boston there was a thing, New York City has something called SBO, school-based option. I think Chicago may or may not have something like that. You can tell me. But here with the faculty vote, then you're able to make a slight change to the contract. And so people approved this. They said, okay, Kim wants to do this. That's fine. We still get written up at the end of the year, but it's putting together a lot of, 10 or 11 of these classroom visits. And so, we think he has an accurate picture. Maybe he saw a couple of bad moments, but he saw overall what was going on. And I thought that was fair. I have made a couple of changes to that since I left the principalship. The things I recommend and do present, write about. But that was how we, to your question, it really was winning the trust of teachers so that they were no longer suspicious or freaking out when I walked into their classroom.
Beautiful. And at some point, that Mather memo became the Marshall Memo. Can you share with us the evolution and the idea of doing this?
The Mather memo was really a staff newsletter. I mean, so it's a little different than the Marshall memo, although there were some things I was trying to do. So the Mather memo was an attempt, and one of my mentors, Roland Barth, had always told me, when you have a staff meeting, don't be giving announcements, don't be reading circulars, be talking about teaching and learning. And the way to do that is to get all the administrative stuff out of the way in a written memo. And remember, this is pre-internet, so it's a paper memo put in people's mailboxes. And I really, I made that into an informative, funny. There were always cartoons or, jokes or contests, or we had a corporate partner who got us tickets to the Red Sox, regular sort of corporate seats. And so I would say, there are four tickets to the Red Sox game or a Celtics game, and just let me know if you're interested. So by the end of the day, I would have like 40 pieces of paper in my mailbox, and we would go through and drawing, for who wanted to take their family to the Red Sox or whatever. So things like that. Birthdays, student birthdays, so anytime a student had a birthday, which is almost every day, they would be wished happy birthday by other people, by lunch monitors, by their math, by their phys ed teacher, etc. So it was a good, lively, and people read it, because, maybe there were going to be Red Sox tickets, or maybe there was going to be a really funny cartoon in the back. I also, in the Mather memo, also would share brief, articles. And so, for example, in those days, Al Shanker was the president of the American Federation of Teachers, a union leader. And he had a wonderful column almost every Sunday in the New York Times, brief column. And I would put that on the back of the Mather memo when it was pertinent to our work, which it often was, or a brief research summary or an article of some kind, sometimes a funny article. And that was really the germ of the Marshall Memo, was, that I would share sort of professional stuff with people. I also did other things with teachers, like I subscribed to magazines, the Reading Teacher, Phi Delta Kappa and stuff like that. And I would we had a teacher resource center, and I would put out the copies of that, or I would Xerox articles. And looking back on it, a lot of those were too long, and people were, I was well-intentioned, and I was still wanted to put them out there. And so really the germ of the Marshall Memo was, which I started the year after I left the principalship in 2003, was let me write a summary of the best articles, because the articles are too long. I mean, even a 4 or 5 page article at Phi Delta Kappa is kind of on the long side, or educational leadership. So if I could do a brief summary of the article, something that could be read in 5 minutes, that would be good. And that's the basic idea of the Marshall Memo, was for me to read widely, pick the best articles, and then write short summaries so that a principal or a teacher leader, instructional coach, superintendent, could read them and get the basic idea. Like this week in the Marshall Memo, there's a wonderful article by Adam Grant about email, about how, don't let emails rule your life. Don't feel like when you get an email, you have to apologize if you don't immediately respond to it. No, email is asynchronous. You can wait 24 hours or even longer. You don't have to. It's not like a ringing telephone. Hello. You got to pick it up immediately. And Adam Grant, who's a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote this wonderful article. And I did a summary of it under a page. So his article was quite a bit longer. And then, and some articles I do are like 40 pages long.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I'm not the only one who looks forward to the Marshall Memo to see what is the topic of discussion, and often bringing those to grade level meetings and to the conversation. Thank you, Kim. Kim, if like in Back to the Future, if you could go back in time to any of the positions you held in the past, what will the Kim of today tell the Kim of back then?
I think with teaching, it would be listen to the advice of people about classroom management. Because, as I mentioned, I had a horrible first year teaching, mostly discipline problems. And I was sort of scornful of some of the classroom management things that I'd been told. Like set up routines, like have a regular routine so that you don't have to nag and threaten and punish people about it. And, learn how to do the look. I don't know if you ever learned how to do the look, the look.
The look, the teacher look.
Yeah, the look. I never learned how to do that. That would have solved a lot of problems. I was very naive. I thought that being a good person and having an interesting curriculum would be enough to have the kids do what I told them to do. Well, guess what? They didn't. They had seen this movie before. The naive teacher, the nice guy who doesn't know how to handle a classroom. So I would, if I could time travel back, I would give myself, I would take the Fred Jones course or some course on classroom management that would help me, not be a martinet, not be, a mean teacher, but know how to handle kids. So for my teaching, that was and I also would, well, of course, it didn't exist in 1969, 1970, but having a clear curriculum through the grade so that I knew what I could hand off to the seventh grade teachers. Really, I mean, some of your best, most important customers are the next grade levels teachers. So the seventh grade teachers, they wanted stuff. They wanted my kids to be able to do certain things in math, to know certain things in social studies, so it has to be part of but we didn't have it at that point. So I was very much on my own. Too much involved in entertaining kids, which, by the way, was part of classroom management. If they're entertained, they'll behave better. So all of that was kind of, I think I did a good job, but I needed to know a lot of things. As a principal, if I could time travel back to the principalship, thinking of the crisis that I described, I would certainly, know better than to confront people and accuse people without the right evidence. Although I thought I did. I thought I had the handwriting. I thought I had them dead to rights, but I didn't, and it caused a huge ruckus. And I'm amazed that my boss didn't fire me. I mean, can you imagine? The area superintendent has like 40 angry teachers from the math school in his office saying,
Wow.
"Get rid of this crazy guy." That's not good. So, instead of confronting and accusing, then doing a little intelligence work, out on the playground. What's up with these memos that's going on? And she said, "Oh yeah, those people are, I couldn't ignore it. It was a cultural issue. I couldn't ignore it, but I would have dealt with it somewhat differently." And I think also as a principal, starting earlier with the mini observations, because I wasted a lot of time and energy, burned the midnight oil, neglected my own children, my personal children, writing up these long write-ups, which are not productive. And, any principal has to do that. And most people know, most central office people know, the people in Chicago, they know that this stuff is not productive. And I'm still trying to persuade them to change their system.
That's a good thing. What advice do you give the principals that you coach or advise in terms of making sure they don't sacrifice, for example, their own children for the sake of the job?
I remember sitting with Claudia Aguirre, who was one of the principals in New York City that I was coaching, a middle school principal, Upper West Side, dual language middle school in New York City public school. And I would visit her regularly, and we talk, we'd visit classrooms, we'd talk strategy and so forth, and data. And at 5 o'clock, she would look at her watch and say, "Got to go." And she had 2 young children, and she left. So that was a firm deadline with her. She was going to leave at 5 o'clock. That was it. And what that did, of course, was it made her get stuff done more efficiently in the rest of the day, because she knew she had that deadline. Whereas if she thought she could stay until 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night or work through the evening, then she wouldn't do certain things more efficiently during the day. So clear limits, clear boundaries is number one. And because there's an infinite amount of work. I mean, being a principal is just, you could work the whole time. You can work, no sleep, everything. So that's one thing. So I just gave this workshop yesterday, actually, and see if I can remember the 4 things that you have to take care of. So one thing is health. So you got to, and that's sleep, nutrition, breakfast, exercise, so forth. The second is spiritual. So whether that's meditation or whether it's religion, whatever it is that fulfills that need in your psyche. Another one is emotions. So that is mostly relationships. It's emotional well-being, and each one of these is like a tank that you have to top up your tank in each one. So the emotional thing is relationships, of course, within the school, but principalship is pretty lonely sometimes. So outside of school, so that's love relationships, friendships, and so forth. And keeping those up. And the last one is mental, is intellectual, and that's where just maybe getting out of a rut, reading stuff. I think you're going to ask me about my favorite books. So
Yes.
a regular basis. And for a very busy principal, the Marshall Memo helps because in 20 minutes you can get on top, and or it even might be less because you might not be interested in a particular article, so you skip over that one. But so keeping your mind alive in terms of what are the new ideas, what are some old ideas that we are rediscovering, that we're thinking some more about. I mean, for example, right now the U.S. is in the middle of this huge debate about literacy, the so-called science of reading debate, which is a very important debate, phonics, and versus whole language versus love of reading versus knowledge, core knowledge, and so forth. And that's being on top of that debate for an elementary principal is a very important thing, because you're going to have parents coming into your office. I listened to this podcast. I listened to Sold the Story. We're doing this all wrong. My kid's not learning how to read. And you have to know what the issues are there, so you don't go down the rabbit hole, so that you can, and also you can make sure your teachers are doing the right thing. Because the big concern is that kids are not being taught how to sound words out. They're being asked to guess the word based upon the pictures on the page rather than knowing how to sound a word out, which is really important. So anyway, that's just that's one of the things that you should know about. As you act as a principal or a teacher, and so forth.
Absolutely. Especially, I see the principal as a public intellectual, because you had to be informed to guide your teachers, but also the families that come with different interests, and one has to be aware. Thank you for that, Kim. So, talking about books, if you will have to gift to a loved one two books, one fiction, one nonfiction, what would those books be?
So the best fiction book I've read in years is A Gentleman in Moscow. I don't know if you've read this book. It is a fictional book about a Russian aristocrat who is locked up in a hotel for the rest of his life. It's in 1921, I think, and because he's an aristocrat, the communists really don't like this guy, and they're going to execute him. But they find out he wrote a sort of revolutionary poem, supposedly, as a young man. So instead of executing him, they confine him to a luxury hotel in downtown Moscow for the rest of his life. And the book follows through, like 50 years as he's a prisoner in this hotel. It's a wonderful book of fiction. It is, and of course, a lot of it is true. For example, in the middle of this, in the 1930s, you hear about the Ukrainian famine. Where Stalin starved millions of people in Ukraine. That's one of the legacies of today's Ukrainian situation. Is people remember that. People remember the famine. So, The Gentleman in Moscow, highly recommended. Amor Towles is the author. In nonfiction, there are a lot of things that excited me. For example, 15,000 Hours was a British book that was part of my epiphany the year I was in grad school about effective schools. Ron Evans, who I studied with, who was one of the gurus, never wrote a book. But the British authors, 15,000 Hours, had a wonderful study of what it is that makes some schools more effective than others with the same population of children. What are these factors? And I will mention one other book, which I'm a huge fan of, which is Teach Like a Champion by Doug Lemov. Teach Like a Champion, the third edition. The third edition is significantly better than the first two and deals very well with the issue of race, which Doug Lemov and other charter school people have really been sort of getting a hard time about in the last few years. So very good on that, but mostly 63 specific teaching techniques that put kids on the path to college. And I love the book, and I love the videos. There are 100 videos with the book that you can watch these teachers in action. And I like that approach, not academic research, but go into classrooms, find the teachers who are getting great results, and then watch very carefully what they're doing and really sort of deconstruct it. And that book is tremendously helpful. Are you a fan of Teach Like a Champion?
I have not read it, but now it's going to be in my book, because I'm always talking about techniques and strategies. And now that I know there's 63 there, that's my next book.
Yes, sir. You will enjoy it. Make sure to get the third edition,
The
3.0.
third edition. Beautiful. Thank you for that advice. Let's take a very quick moment to praise Teach Better Community.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
So, Kim, who is or who are your biggest influences?
I think that Ron Edmonds, who I mentioned a moment ago, is one of the big ones. So when I was a sixth grade teacher, 1978, had been there for almost 10 years. I read a New York Times article about Ron Edmonds' research. He was a Harvard professor, African American, who did research on effective schools. And he had 5 factors that made some schools much more effective than others. And of course, the first one was the principal as an instructional leader. And I said, I never really thought about being a principal. I had kind of a negative view of principals, My principal in our office all the time, gave me a hard time when I tried things and so forth. So then I took a year off, as I mentioned, 81, back at the Harvard Ed School, and Ron Evans was there. And I studied with him. I was in a seminar with him. He was an absolute inspiration to me in terms of specifically what it looks like. What are these 5 factors that make an effective school? And that was really my whole platform when I started as a principal, was the Ron Edmonds sort of effectiveness factors. It drove some people crazy, as I mentioned. There was not a positive reception among some people, especially the real sort of veteran people in the school. But Ron was a huge influence on me. Another one was Roland Barthes, who's written a number of books, died quite recently. He was a mentor of mine. He taught me something very interesting. I met him when he was a principal in Massachusetts. He pushed his desk against the wall, and having the desk against the wall rather than sitting behind the desk like the president of the United States, had set a whole different tone in the office. And he was big on getting into classrooms. He was also big on giving teachers the budget, the instructional materials budget, so they could decide what they were going to spend their money on. And Roland's a wonderful and a wise man. And one of the nice things about the Marshall Memo is when someone like that dies, as he did a couple of years ago, I went through and found all the great quotes from Roland Barthes that had a big chunk of the Marshall Memo devoted to his quotes, some of his wonderful quotes.
Wow. Can you tell me more about the pushing the desk towards the wall? That sounds very interesting.
Well, so if you have a desk, in the middle of the room, or sort of, and you sit behind it, then that's a very sort of authoritarian type of posture. People come in, there's a desk between the two of you. And as I said, it's sort of like, the presidential kind of look. And by turning the desk around and pushing it against the wall, then you have a small conference table, I had a small round table in my office that could fit, 3 or 4 or 5 people around it. And then, I just turn my chair around and wheel up to the table, and then we'd have a meeting. Entirely different feel to an office, when you have that kind of dynamic. I don't know what your setup is in your office, but it
is like the opposite, right? I sit like the president, but now that you say that makes a lot of sense. Just push the desk to the wall.
I don't know if you've watched Abbott Elementary, the very popular TV program about a school in Philadelphia. It's in fact, the lead actress is, I think, won some kind of award for this. It's a very popular program. Anyway, the principal in that school sits behind the desk, and I'm using a photograph of that at my workshops. Here's how it looks, in the traditional principal's office, which is the way a lot of people have done it. So just
wow. That's a change I have to do on Monday. Thank you so much, Kim. Kim, everybody at some point doubts themselves or think they're not good enough or smart enough, etc. Psychologists call this imposter syndrome. How do you address this, and what advice do you have?
Well, I think the big thing where I felt, that I wasn't worthy, I guess that's the thing, did my college make an admissions mistake in letting me in, and so forth. I always looked, and I'm 75 years old now. I don't look it now, but I always looked very young for my age. When I was in college, I looked like about 12 years old. I was a late bloomer, and I just looked, really, really young. And I looked young as a teacher. I looked young as a principal, and that sort of worked against me. I had to prove myself. I had to prove that I was a serious person, and maybe, that made me go overboard in some ways. But the fact of the matter is, I am a pretty privileged white male. I have a lot of things which I've gotten in touch with. And a lot of the thinking now is in what ways that I had tremendous advantages. In my life, in terms of private school education, going to school at British boarding school, going to Harvard, etc. And so I haven't had to deal with imposter syndrome perhaps as much as a lot of other people have. I had roommates in college who thought they were an admissions mistake. I've talked to them at our reunions, at our Harvard reunions. They say, I can't believe they let me in. It must have been a mistake, which is so unfortunate. Of course, part of where I got in was my father went there. My grandfather went there. So I had the legacy, which is now being contested. Harvard is getting a lot of pressure now. Don't give an advantage to, okay. Now I'm thinking I have imposter syndrome because I didn't really deserve to get into Harvard. It's because I was a legacy. Okay. So I have to really ponder that one, but it's too late.
Beautiful. So it's never too late. I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about productivity. As you know, productivity is something that means different things for different people. When you look back at your principal years, what were the glows of or the way you organize yourself, and what were some of the grows?
I was sitting in a boring meeting once, a superintendent's meeting or something. And by the way, I was famous for falling asleep in the superintendent's meetings. I was asleep, and if I wasn't stimulated, I would doze off. But I figured out in this meeting that I worked about 78 hours a week. Now that's way too much. That is, I worked, like one of the questions I ask in my time management workshops is, do you take one full day of the weekend completely off, like where you do no work whatsoever? And I did not take my own advice. I worked, very hard, pretty much through the weekend. I got up very early in the morning, like 5 o'clock, in the morning, wrote the Mather memo. And I think that really took its toll, because one of the things that happens when you don't get enough sleep is you lose your sense of humor. And your sense of, by the way, that might have helped in my crisis with the anti-memos. If I just found a funny way to deal with, maybe I would do an anti-memo or something like that. But so I'm an example of somebody who worked too many hours, and it took its toll, and that's why I got exhausted. After 15 years as a principal is not bad, but so setting limits, I would say, but I was, So as the Marshall Memo, I have some productivity advice there. So I've kept this now for coming up on 20 years. So every 50 issues a year, every week, with a couple of weeks off in the summer or Christmas. And one of the secrets to that has been, as the magazines, I subscribe to 60 magazines, and newspapers and hard copy, most of it. And as they come in, I put them aside. They're right over here, and they pile up. I just got 3 magazines today. I got Teachers College Record, I got Social Studies and the Young Thing, I got Communique. So I don't look at them when they come in. And the online stuff that comes in, like ASCD Smart Brief and stuff, or Gadfly or something, I'll quickly print out the articles but won't look at them. All the reading for the Marshall Memo takes place on Sunday. I sit down and spend about 8 hours in a comfortable chair, going through about 150 articles quickly and folding over the 8 or 9 that I think are promising. And then on Monday, I do all the writing. And then the rest of the week, I'm out there in schools. I'm coaching principals. I'm giving workshops in person or online. And I'm out in the real world, seeing what principals are really going through. And by the way, as you know, this has been a really, really tough year for teachers and principals. Very tough year. So that's, I guess the moral there is compress the work. And the same goes for email. Like not a principal not trying to keep up with email during the day. That's going to have you trapped in your office. What I recommend, and people are startled when they hear this, is have an out of office message during the school day that says something like, "Thank you for emailing me. If it is urgent, call this number, my cell phone number, or my assistant. But if it's not urgent, I will get back to you at 3:30 this afternoon, because I am in classrooms in the cafeteria, in teacher meetings. I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing now. And, of course, you have to get permission from your superintendent to do this. But most superintendents that I've talked to are head of schools. They say immediately, what a great idea. Because I don't want my principal sitting at their desk at 10 o'clock in the morning answering emails. And the other thing about that is, in terms of time management, it really discourages people from emailing you in the middle of the day. It makes them think about, can I get this problem solved some other way? Because he's not going to get back to me right away. So I got to deal with this. And, you need a first responder. You need, of course, I mean, people need to be able to reach us at any time now. There's the school shootings and stuff like that. You have to be able to reach the principal in the bathroom. I mean, it's, whenever or wherever. But setting limits on that, I think, is really an important thing in terms of productivity, because then you can do the really productive work.
In your book, you mentioned that you didn't take notes because you didn't want to interfere with the union issue, and I asked you this question in person before, but how does your vision of that have evolved with time? How should principals take notes or not during their supervision observations?
Well, you're remembering correctly that I was burned in losing this grievance. And so that made me very gun shy about taking notes. And so I didn't. I would jot a couple of things after I left the classroom. I think that was an overreaction. I don't think most teachers would not have minded if I jotted a few notes, but what they would have minded is sitting with a laptop at the back of the room, just type everything that's going on. That makes people nervous. And also, they don't really know if you're writing about them or if you're chopping or writing emails or filling out reports or whatever. So my position now is that you should take some very brief notes, just like with a little pad of paper or something, but not extensive. This whole idea of scripting, I think, is unproductive. I mean, unless you're, trying to fire a teacher and you need to really get very, very detailed notes, and there you shift gears. You shift gears from many observations to full lesson observations. But 99% of teachers, you're not trying to fire them. You're trying to appreciate what they're doing, and give them praise and feedback, and then coach on it. On something specific. So my position now is taking a little notepad or a card or something, and write down something that you will probably forget. Like a kid says something really funny or something really wise. Write it down, word for word, while it's still fresh in your mind, because you will forget that later. And then one more thing is, there are teachers who are sensitive about that. And like when I do a poll, I always use polling devices when I do presentations, anonymous polling. And when I ask what people's personal preference is for note taking, there always are one or two people who say, don't take any notes. Like, it makes them nervous. It freaks them out. What are you writing down? Is this going in my record? Is this going to be in your Facebook page? Whatever. And so I would respect those people. But I think they would get over it pretty quickly, because if you're going to have a conversation, if it's all very low key, so low tech is my big thing. Don't bring laptops, don't bring tablets, just bring yourself, and above all, pay attention, be present, look over kids' shoulders, look at the work that they're doing, chat with kids, when the teacher's not addressing the class, chat with kids. What are you learning today? And that way you can really smell the roses in a classroom, and then jot quick notes, and then as soon as possible afterward, have a face-to-face conversation where you ask open-ended questions like, did you get your intended learning results? What happened after I left? That looked really interesting. Or this kid seemed excited. What's going on with that? And then you shift gears and get into maybe there's a critical point, like you're only calling on the boys, or you're only calling on the kids who raise their hands, that sort of thing.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Kim, when the curtains close and you take out the cape of consultant, principal, coach, what do you do for fun?
Great question. So I am really interested in what's going on in the world. I read 2 newspapers. I read the New York Times, about the paper edition of the New York Times, because I don't want to be on a device all day long. Enough with the computers. And so the paper, and the New York Times is doing a superb job of covering the news. I'm fascinated with what's going on in Ukraine. I'm fascinated with the politics. I'm fascinated with psychology, new insights in science and so forth. And I read the paper quite thoroughly. It takes me an hour and a half to read the New York Times. And just yesterday, I was on a plane and caught up on 2 days of papers. I love to read books. I'm reading a book now about the Panama Canal that's absolutely fascinating. David McCulloch's book on the path between the seas. I love being with my wife. We've been married for 50 years. It's on our 50th anniversary. We spend wonderful time together. And my grandchildren, I have 2 grandchildren, 2 children, both of whom are teachers. So the people part of it is central to my life. I believe very passionately in exercise. So I have 3 outs every week, a combination of aerobic and strength. Keep myself in shape because I want to keep my marbles as long as possible, keep healthy. So I think that's pretty much everything. Yeah, I like to fix
Beautiful.
things. As I was that as the principal, I still like to fix things.
Can you tell us a little bit about your exercise routine, which is a part that many of us ignore?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you don't have to run marathons to be in shape. I trained for a marathon once, and it just about killed me. I'm not built for marathons. But the wisdom that I go with is 20 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 days a week. And aerobics can be anything. I mean, it can be running, it can be jogging, it can be fast walking, it can be swimming, it can be bicycling. It's anything that gets your heart beating. Squash, tennis, whatever, pickleball, which I haven't played yet, but I have some friends who love pickleball. So the aerobics is important. And 3 days a week. I mean, some people would say 5, but 3 days a week is so I do like Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. The aerobics. But if you're over 40 years old, then you have to start worrying about muscles, losing muscle mass and tone and so forth. And so that's when you really start to need the strength. And I started that fairly recently, got a personal trainer. She taught my wife and I a customized strength routine that takes account of my back and my knees and stuff. And so that's about 20 minutes. So I do that back to back with the aerobics. So I'll, 20 minutes of strength. It's a very thorough routine. It uses, every muscle in my body and it's right here in the house, so I don't go to a gym. It's have weights, have a ball, have a chin-up bar, and go through that. And then I do 20 minutes on the treadmill. And by the way, not running anymore. I can't run anymore, but walking on an incline. And then one day a week, I have a rowing machine, which is really great. And by the way, the key to all of that is music. I have
Ooh.
really, really good playlists. So with the strength, it's a lot about a vocal music, and with the treadmill and the rowing machine, it's R&B. So the music,
Ooh.
without the music, it would be very boring. But the music is the key to making it fun, and just have a terrific playlist. And so that really makes it possible. So basically, we're talking about 40 minutes, at 3 different times during the week, and that takes care of pretty much everything.
Beautiful. Oh my goodness. This has been a master class. Any last words for the viewers or listeners of the show?
Well, I think the real work in education is going on in schools, and it's teachers do the real work, and principals create a climate where that is possible. Protect teachers from nonsense from outside. Appreciate their work, keep them in the game, and so the combination of teachers and principals, instructional coaches. My daughter, who's been teaching for 18 years, is just interviewing for a job as an instructional coach. So she would be a coach in Boston. If she gets the job, she's going to hear in a couple of days. Our son teaches high school history. We're so proud of what our kids do. It's the real work in education. And I just, the other thing is for the people above them, the superintendents, the school boards, the politicians, for them not to screw it up. Because they've done some pretty bad things over the last 20 years. For example, the whole thing of using test scores to evaluate teachers, the value add calculations, that was a very ill-advised initiative, and it has been discredited, and a few states are still hanging on to it, but we got to get away from that. However, Obama and Arnie Duncan, who started that whole business, were right in saying that it's about student learning. If they didn't learn it, you didn't teach it. But they had the wrong approach of using test scores and calculations to evaluate teachers. The way to do it is the day-by-day work. Going into a classroom, looking over kids' shoulders. Are they getting it? Talking to the teacher afterwards, looking at the work, going to the teacher team meeting where they gave a common assessment to these fourth graders and looking at how did it go? And again, that golden question. Efrain, your kids did better than mine. What did you do? Tell me about the technique. you use, if you hear that question in a teacher team meeting, or from a principal to a principal, or from a superintendent to a superintendent, your kids are doing better than mine. What are you doing? Just constant curiosity about, what is really working. Because guess what? Some teachers are getting much better learning results than others, and they're doing it every day. Some of the best teaching in the world is going on in some of our classrooms, and the opposite is true in some other classrooms. And so the job of the principal, instructional coach, assistant principal, superintendent, assistant superintendent is to help amplify those good practices and gradually improve those that are mediocre, because the mediocre practices are harming kids, and the poor practices too, of course.
Amen. Kim, has been a pleasure to have you in my show.
It has been a pleasure talking to you. I hope this is helpful to all of you out there in the field. We don't say good luck. We shouldn't say good luck in our field. We should say much.
Would you say what? Can you say that again?
Much success.
Much success. Amen. And we leave you with that. Happy Saturday.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez.
Chulo.
And that production. Chill out.